Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. I'm Murray Rundus, the production manager and managing editor here at CFN. Very happy to be joined once again by with Serre Verweij, and we're here recapping this latest conclave that just occurred that elected Pope Leo XIV. It was Robert Francis Prevost, and you see a lot of outlets out there saying this man was a complete unknown. Where did this guy come from? Well, I mean, in reality, the people who were studying the issue, this certainly was in play. People were talking about Robert Francis Prevost as a very likely candidate. We listed him in our conclave overview as a top three candidate. We were looking at Erdo, we were looking at Parolin, and when it came to the moderates, something Serre pointed out is that it seemed Prevost was the favorite there. It was trending in that direction. But now we're here recapping what just happened, what happened with this conclave, and having some speculation about it, but also giving some reasoned analysis going forward so that we can know what we're dealing with. Serre, before we begin, something I really want to start with is I want to know if you share this belief I have, which is that what the conclave, I think, shows us is that we can have a reasonable analysis of the Vatican in the modern period and of the College of Cardinals. We had a lot of people speculating it was going to be somebody who nobody had any idea was even in play. But I think what this shows us is that we can actually make some determinations, some predictions going forward, especially with this mass information that we have in the age of the internet. Do you agree with that? Do you think that this proves that we can have that kind of knowledge with the conclave?
Yes, I fully agree with that. It's interesting, if this conclave had lasted a lot longer and some kind of unknown candidate from the peripheries had been elected that only a few people had mentioned, like, say, Ferrao from India, if he was now a new pope, then it would have become clear that this speculation is pointless, because I think it was like maybe the number 25 candidate who was being discussed. But that isn't what happened here. Prevost wasn't the one who was promoted by betting markets. He wasn't the one who was a lot in the secular media, but he was a lot in the Catholic media. So I'll say the election of Prevost shows that Catholic media speculation and Catholic media conclave analysis can still be successful in this day and age. But at the same time, I do think it shows how weak secular Vatican analysis has become and how weak these betting markets have become. So I think there it kind of separates the wheat from the chaff, as they say. So
yeah, I completely agree. I think this does show that there are just certain trends we can look at. And of course, this is not to discount the influence that the Holy Ghost has. But as you know, as I've said on these shows, it's not as if this is some infallible, this man is the perfect man for the job, will not have any problems. Popes are fallible people. Especially in the human element of the church. And the conclave is something that relies on the human element of the church quite a bit. Now, going to that length of the conclave right away, I was a bit surprised about two things here at St. Peter's here in Rome. The first thing that caught me off guard was that long delay that first night. Yeah. I thought that I had no idea what that could have been. There was speculation from Austin Ivory that was the result of a papal homilist going way over the allotted time he was given. There was a whole bunch of questions about that, whether that violated the oath of secrecy or not. He clarified that it could have been based on speculation from people who saw him going in and out. And then secondly, the thing that caught me off guard was the late white smoke we had on that final day. It's surprising, I think, that we had such a short conclave, but that certainly it was certainly a later smoke than I imagined. Do you think that was just because these cardinals didn't know each other, that they were confused about the process, or do you see something else in that later smokes for both of those days?
For the first day, I actually do just believe the rumors that sermon went on a lot longer than planned. Ivarai's explanation for how sources would have worked in this case seems rather plausible. If, say, the drivers of the person who held that sermon, if they drove him home a lot later, then they would know what was going on, and they probably would want to share something like that with the media. I think it can play a part that there were a few more cardinals, but I mean, it was 133 this time compared to 115. That's not exactly a immense increase. It's a bit over 10% more cardinals, but that's it. So I don't think that would make the conclave so much longer. The possibility that it's because they're all new cardinals, I would question that, because every cardinal except for Ratzinger was new at the conclave in 2005. They had all been appointed by John Paul II, and it was their first conclave. In 2013, the majority of cardinals were already appointed by Benedict, and therefore it was their first conclave too. Although I'll be fair that it was then over 40% that had taken part in the 2005 conclave. But so this isn't that exceptional. There were more old cardinals here than there were in 2005. So I don't think that would explain why it would take so long on the first day. Either just a technical malfunction or just that long sermon, or a combination of those, I think makes the most sense. The delay on the second day, that raises more questions. Why not show the white smoke immediately? I think that will likely always remain speculation on the level of speculation about white smoke in the 1958 conclave. I think it might just have been because once the Pope is actually elected, they try to plan so that the whole presenting the new Pope thing goes as smoothly as possible. And when they're so focused on that, I think maybe that was just it. They didn't want to have white smoke immediately, because then people would expect to see the Pope in an hour, and maybe they needed like 2.5 to 3 hours to get that ready. I don't think that was particularly suspicious, no.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that. Even though it was strange for everybody in the square, I think I can understand, and I would prefer that we have a smooth introduction for the Pope, even if it means they have to show the smoke later. I don't think there's any problem with that whatsoever. But the other thing that I think is quite interesting, and it might give us some insight into how Pope Leo XIV's papacy will go, especially with who he chooses to be in the Curia, was looking at the length of the conclave itself. Very short in comparison to what I was thinking it was going to be. I thought it was going to be a much longer conclave. If I'm correct, it was the same amount of ballots, that we saw John Paul I and Benedict XVI get. And so rather smooth election for provost. How do you think, I mean, we're not going to have certain knowledge unless one of the cardinals leaks it. And I don't think that's, even then it won't be certain, it won't be exact, but just raising some speculation. Do you think that this shows that the cardinals were united around provost ahead of time, both parties, both the liberals and the conservatives within the conclave, or the more liberal, more conservative ones? Do you think they were united around provost before the conclave even started?
No, I don't think so at all. I think conservatives had vetted him. That's why he had that meeting with Burke. They made sure that he would be an acceptable, if not good, candidate to them. I think that's what happened. I think provost also had quite a bit of enthusiasm already on the first ballot, which made him a viable candidate. But what I think really was the decisive factor was that basically the moderate liberals, and whichever moderates they could attract to their side, I think they folded for the fourth ballot. I think that's really what happened. I think some conservatives supported Provost on the first ballot, and probably on the morning of the second day, during the second and the third ballot, I think they all went over from Erdo, Arborelius, because they are the ones who are now mainly being mentioned as getting votes on the first ballot. I think the conservatives switched to Provost pretty quickly because they vetted him, because they felt confident enough about him. So they switched to Provost. But then really the issue was Parolin, according to some inside sources, apparently tried to reach a deal with Tagle, so with the more liberal side. But it seems as though not even that was sufficient to ever give him a two-thirds majority. Basically, Parolin realized after the third ballot that he had reached his limit, and that his alliance of certain moderates, moderate liberals, and even Tagle's liberals would never win over anyone else. So then he had to fold, and as soon as he did that, and they joined in with the conservatives, Provost got elected on the fourth ballot with more than 100 votes, according to several cardinals, it seems. So that's really impressive. He needed only 89. He got over 100. And that does raise the question, who were the 30 or so cardinals who did not vote for him on the fourth ballot? And I suspect that those were largely Tagle voters who had not gone over to Parolin, and possibly also other liberal voters who were scattered. It's mentioned that the most fanatical loyalists of Francis, that they supported either Greg from Malta, or they supported Aveline, who is ironically, it seems, actually a moderate conservative, but they supported him nonetheless because he has a different image. And I suspect that not all of those had ever gone over to Parolin, so then they also didn't go over to Prevost. But so I think it's basically went, roughly in 3 steps. Prevost does well on the first ballot, then it gets all of the conservatives and certain moderate conservatives and just moderates from the peripheries behind him. Finally, Parolin realizes that even with a Tagle deal, he can't win. So then Parolin's bloc supports him, and he becomes pope. I think that's what happened. So I think that's what we kind of see with those roughly 100 or more cardinals is we see what size the conservative and Parolin bloc are together. We kind of see everything that's not radical liberal.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that. Yeah, I think it's interesting that. I mean, even looking at this, now this is based on some things cardinals have said, as you mentioned, and they've probably revealed a bit too much than they probably should have. I mean, I noticed the American cardinals loved to talk about this when they were recapping it. One thing I'll ask you as which you can deal with, and I think this might be what many people are saying though, is somebody like Father James Martin was saying this is one of his favorite candidates, Prevost, ahead of time. And so I think some are saying, well, it's that and the enthusiasm that Leo XIV has received from many sides, but as the liberals seem to be somewhat satisfied with him. Do you think that shows that that the liberals did have a backing behind Prevost ahead of time? If not, why do you speculate someone like Father James Martin and occasionally some of these other radical liberals, why do you think they got behind Prevost?
I think there's a number of reasons for that. One thing I will note is that it also seems as though James Martin's support for Prevost may have been somewhat overstated before the conclave, before the voting, because I know Info Vaticano spoke of that, but that was in part because James Martin was in Rome together with Austin Everai, and they inferred that Everai supported Prevost, and from that they then extrapolated that Martin would have as well. But their arguments as to why Everai would actually support Prevost, I wasn't entirely convinced of that. Basically, Everai reacted defensive when they brought up accusations against Prevost, and he seemed to be annoyed that in general conservative media were now focusing on scandals also related to Tagle and to Parolin. And so it was that defensive reaction where he was tired of attacks by conservative media on everyone who was not someone like Erdo. It was his response to that they inferred as indicating that they were insulting his candidate. And that's definitely possible. But so that by itself, I don't think is entirely certain. What I think may have played a role is, one, the fact that Čupich did really support Prevost. Ironically, both very progressive and very conservative American cardinals, and also it seems Latin American cardinals, supported Prevost. And so that may have made them think that he was their guy. And it may have also been the way Čupich presented Prevost, or intel they got from Čupich. So I think Čupich's role in that was very important. Secondly, I think it's because of the way Prevost has come off to a lot of people before being made Pope, the way he acts, his demeanor. German bishops seemed initially less worried because when they had meetings with him and Parolin and other curia heads to discuss all of that German synodal way stuff, he was just more attentive and a listener, and they inferred from that less opposition, which that isn't actually very smart, because someone who listens but who doesn't say anything, who doesn't even hint at anything supportive, can also just be reserved and prudent rather than in any way neutral about what you're saying. But it does seem to have been that demeanor which made a lot of people like him. And I think the same thing is therefore true for James Martin, because he at one point sat at the table with him during the Synod on Synodality. And Prevost at the time wasn't exactly the kind of person to rock the boat, to get into arguments, to sound reactionary. He doesn't have the temperament of someone like Cardinal Muller, who's very fierce, and also not Cardinal Burke. And his conservative views, in as much as he has them, are a lot less well known. So I think it's the fact that his views are less known, that he doesn't express them strongly, that he just comes off friendly, and that he had a few liberal American backers who thought that he would be on their side, or at least not too bad. I think all of that played a part. And finally, also the fact that he does seem to have some social views, not even socialist views, but social views that show some overlap with Francis. And they then assume a whole lot based on that, which honestly I think was wishful thinking. And I think some of them are waking up to it now, because Hollerich now is apparently speculating that he could reinterpret fiducia supplicans. And we also had the German bishop who was appointed recently, who now said that his election may put a damper on their reforms. So it seems though some progressives in Europe are already waking up to what's happening.
Yeah, no, I want to talk to you about that general strategy that Pope Leo seems to have. I think you're right on. I think that's his goal, is to sort of reinterpret Francis in the light of some more conservative popes in past ages. I think that's his goal. But I want to start, before looking into that specifically, with something that we talked about in our last conclave overview, which was that the conservatives were actively, it seems, trying to use the word collegiality almost as a dog whistle to get the power back to the bishops, the individual bishop. And what I've wondered is, because there's been a lot of talk about Pope Leo XIV mentioning synodality and saying we need to continue with being a synodal church. To some extent, I think we can say that he's doing this to really show continuity with Francis, to not rock the boat. But do you think we can read anything about his endorsement of synodality, either of being a rejection of that that conservative assertion of the collegiality language, or is he trying to use synodality in a similar way? And again, this is not to make a judgment and an examination on both the terms synodality and collegiality and the concepts behind it. But what do you think Pope Leo XIV means when he's trying to say we should be a synodal church?
I think his address to the College of Cardinals is the most important key in interpreting that, because he literally referenced Francis's first document, Evangelii Gaudium. He referenced that, and that made a lot of liberals enthusiastic. Yes, he's referencing Pope Francis, he's referencing the basic ideas of his pontificate, he's referencing the Second Vatican Council. But if you then look at which key elements of that document he cites, it's very important that he literally speaks of synodality and collegiality together. Francis spoke of that originally at the beginning of his papacy, and a lot of bishops and cardinals were enthusiastic about that. And then throughout the years, he seemed to increasingly move away from that. So in a way, Pope Leo XIV's new hermeneutic of continuity emphasizes the early ideals of Pope Francis rather than what actually became of them. And specifically mentioning collegiality and synodality together in his very first address, to me signals that it's not a rejection of the conservative pro-collegiality stance. Instead, it's a support of it. It's an endorsement where synodality is being reconciled with collegiality. And what I think further shows that is that he references the sensus fidei from the document, but originally Francis referred to it as being mainly expressed through things like popular piety, and that's something that Pope Leo XIV here reaffirms. Now, that's not the interpretation of the sensus fidei that Walter Kasper or the German bishops or even Greg support. Their interpretation is basically, if a lot of secular laity who don't even often attend the church but might do so for holidays, if they say in, say, opinion polls, we want married priests, we want women priests, we want gay marriage, then it means the church doctrine on these things were wrong and they can now be revived. And the fact that the laity in African countries who are way more devout and actually go to church, that they think otherwise, well, either they're kind of outright attacked in a racist way where they're called uneducated African Catholics, or they're basically told, well, you can believe that in Africa, but the truth is then different in Europe. That's the way it was framed recently by the real progressives during the Synod on Synodality. And so our new Pope has basically already signaled, no, the sensus fidei, that's just expressing things like popular devotion like it originally was, with things like Mary's Immaculate Conception and pilgrimages and all that. And synodality is once again connected to collegiality. And he also referenced the important role of cardinals in advising the Pope, which I can't really interpret as anything but a snub against Pope Francis, who's kind of famous or infamous, if you will, for not holding any real consistories with his cardinals after 2014 or 2015. So I think it's very clear that he's embraced that conservative rhetoric, but in a way that emphasizes reform and continuity, in a way that appeals to moderates who didn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, were positive about some moderate form of synodality. But so this is not the German form of synodality. This is not Gres form of synodality. This is the form of synodality that, as Cardinal Sebastian Francis from Malaysia has noted, has already been practiced in Malaysia since the late 1970s, based on a conservative interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, which had the support of both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. So that is what's now being pushed by our new Pope, because that's actually very valuable to look at, that there were certain African and Asian cardinals who were generally positive about the synod on synodality, who weren't just paying lip service to it, but who really liked it, but who at the same time did not care for anything of the German synodal agenda. And if you look at it, that form of synodality, that moderate form, which some argue even Pope Francis himself would favor, it's much more in continuity with the two popes before Francis. It's more in continuity with a conservative reading of the Second Vatican Council. It's focused on the bishop as chief shepherd, but on him being supported in his mission by priests, by monks, by nuns, and even by devout lay people, and consulting with them in a lot of practical matters, such as reorganizing parishes and financial projects and all that, on which a bishop is not necessarily infallible. It's that form of synodality that I think will now be rehabilitated, or will now be very optimistic about that.
Yeah, it's very interesting, because I think even though I have problems with how collegiality is expressed, I mean, even in the documents, I think it's very ambiguous. The Second Vatican Council documents themselves speaking on collegiality, I think there's problems there. You can weigh it with past magisterial teaching as well. But the fact of the matter is, in the current state of the church, is that you're dealing with two interpretations. One is as you said, a more conservative interpretation that's, I think, seeing, especially in light of Pope Francis, seeing that you do have a problem with, again, as we discussed on our last episode on this, a pope that is sort of appointing lay people that are his favorites and then lording over the bishops in a way that neglects the traditional principle of subsidiarity. And I think there is definitely things you can find in preconciliar teaching that goes along with those concerns, and saying that subsidiarity needs to be practiced in the church. The Pope should not be, though the Pope has immediate jurisdiction, he should receive advice from the college around him, from the College of Bishops, that's useful for the church, and that's a healthy way for the church to operate, versus a very liberal interpretation that, as you said, seeks the lay people to sort of democratize the church, where it goes in and out, whether what the secular world thinks is now what the church thinks. Those are two completely different issues and interpretations, and it simply would be naive to say that there's no difference between those two. And I think Pope Leo XIV, at least it seems, is siding with the more conservative one with these documents. And I think you gave a really good case for that there. Now, what I want to ask, and this is what I think is why I remain somewhat optimistic about this pontificate, is I see an inevitable conflict with the more liberal wing of the church. I think these liberals will inevitably see that they're in conflict with this conservative leaning message of Pope Leo XIV. And I could see him even becoming more sympathetic to the traditional position because of that. Do you see it being an inevitable conflict that Pope Leo XIV will come into with the liberal bishops, with the liberal cardinals? Or do you think there's something about his temperament that could prevent all of that? What do you think?
I don't think temperament will necessarily be key, because I think the German synodal project is so ideological that once it becomes clear that he won't support that, they'll stop caring for his likable temperament. So I don't think that will be decisive. I think the chances for a confrontation are very strong. The only thing we have to keep in mind is that it's possible that German opposition will just fizzle out. I don't think of that laity committee, of the German Central Committee in Germany. They'll try to keep up the fight. The question is whether German bishops will eventually fold and will just step back in line and give in to Rome again, rather than stand by them. I don't think that's entirely certain. I think that can go either way to some extent, because I think they were pinning their hopes a lot on the Pope who would be more progressive than Francis, because Francis was increasingly dampening their spirits and it was making them pessimistic. And I think they were biding their time. So if Pope Leo XIV isn't even more conservative than Francis, but he's also not more progressive, that already will be somewhat of a defeat to them. But if he's even just slightly more conservative, if he's just like Parolin has been against them for the last few years, that already greatly complicates their position, especially because, well, he's now young. With Francis, I think they were waiting for what would happen after him. Now they have to deal with this new Pope for probably at least 10 years, if not 20 years or more. I think that plays a large part. So I think it's possible it will fizzle out, but that is indeed not guaranteed. It can still come to a head. And if that happens, it likely could push our new Pope even more towards the conservative side. And something I think is important to remember in this context is our new Pope is in an ideal position to isolate the Germans. And the question is how they'll respond to that. Because to some extent, the Germans have made use of the fact that there's a few other church provinces in Europe that aren't as aggressively progressive as they are, but they basically share the same aims. They just aren't as openly defined. And our new Pope can now easily change that because there's a vacancy in the Archdiocese of Vienna in Austria, in another German-speaking country. If he appoints a much more young, conservative Austrian priest, if he looks for such a priest to succeed Christoph Schomborn, then suddenly the Germans lose an important stronghold in their southern neighbor. There's also, I think, 2 vacancies currently in Switzerland. Switzerland in total has 6 diocesan bishops. 2 of those currently are conservative, but then there's also 2 vacancies, and there's basically 2 progressives. So if he appoints 2 conservatives to the vacancies in Switzerland, it's suddenly supermajority conservative as well. And then there's Belgium, the one other country that really pushes prayers and blessings for gay couples. Currently, 3 bishops in Belgium are over 75. And the papal nuncio in Belgium is openly a conservative opponent of the liberal Belgian bishops. So if he takes advantage of that and he appoints 3 conservatives in Belgium too, well, then suddenly they look a lot more outflanked on all sides. The question is how long they would keep up their resistance then. Would it make them more aggressive? Would it make them react frightened? Or would they just gradually start to fold? I think that will become really important. So whom he appoints, the bishops he appoints, but also obviously the cardinals, this will become an important part of the dealings with the synodal way.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be the important thing to watch in this pontificate, because if he does face even small amounts of resistance that's slowly fizzling out, if he does start, as you said, to become more amicable towards the traditionalist sides that are more critical even of the documents of the Second Vatican Council themselves, then I think we could see even the potential for the magisterium coming and clarifying that certain documents before the Second Vatican Council hold more weight, have a higher theological note than certain elements of the Second Vatican Council, and could really fix. That's a solution to the crisis potentially. Another element, though, I think that a lot of people are thinking about is how the liturgy is going to play out. And I don't want to drift too much into speculation here, because I think it's sort of not useful to get into what ifs. But one thing I do think is important is looking for certain signs that we might look for and certain signs to avoid. Do you think that it's okay that many of these people looking at, for example, red shoes or different elaborate mazzettas and reading into the fact that it seems the Pope is going to go back into the palace rather than the other residence that Pope Francis went to, are those valid signs that the Pope might be moving in a more conservative liturgical direction? Or do you think we need to look for some better substance when it comes to seeing where the Pope is going or not?
I definitely think they're positive signs. They're at least not bad signs. Currently, there's nothing suggesting he has any kind of hostility towards the traditional Latin Mass or any traditional customs. I will even add and say that it clearly shows that he does not have the same influences of people's theology or liberation theology that Francis is said to have had. I think it clearly was also him throwing a bone to fans of Benedict XVI, so it's a good start. But I don't think it's the most important thing. I think another important factor is that most bishops didn't like Traditionis Custodes, and they had to be really pressured and almost bullied by Rome, and specifically by Roche. in order to suppress it further. So I think that by itself, most local bishops will be more sympathetic towards the Tridentine Mass now, ironically, than maybe even before Traditionis Custodes. I think because of Traditionis Custodes, the Tridentine Mass is now associated with resistance against the stuff that was happening in Rome for the last couple of years. So I think in a way, Traditionis Custodes might have made the Tridentine Mass more popular with moderate conservatives who weren't fans of what they were seeing. I think the fact that young priests, that they're more sympathetic towards the Tridentine Mass, shows that also just the passage of time will help traditionalists. But really, what will be key to see is whom our new Pope will appoint to replace Cardinal Roche, because Roche is over 75, and his 5-year term as head of his dicastery ends in May next year. At the same time, the 5-year term of the secretary of that dicastery, Viola, will also end. Now, Viola is still a lot younger, but so he's rumored to be even more hostile towards the Tridentine Mass than Roche, and to have been very ambitious. The question is, will Pope Leo X, Pope Leo XIV, will his reserved temperament cause him to replace Roche with Viola based on just respect for gradual promotions and for all kinds of precedents within the Curie? Will he allow Viola to become the new prefect after Roche and to maybe even become a cardinal, just in order to not rock the boat? I think that will be an important thing to watch out for. I don't think the chances for that are immense, but I can't entirely discount them either. But if he doesn't make Viola Roche's successor, if he appoints someone completely different, who might not even be a traditionalist, but who just wasn't a part of the anti-Tridentine camp, then the main enforcement arm of Traditionis Custodes will already disappear, regardless of whether the document is officially scrapped or not. So I think their personnel policy and a general attitude of either continuity or discontinuity with the last few years of Francis is in a way almost more important than the Pope's personal sympathies, because I don't think Francis ever liked the Tridentine Mass, but it went unharmed for almost 8 years of his pontificate, because he didn't want to rock the boat in terms of liturgy wars until he made kind of a switch in that regard around 2020. But before that, he put Serre in the position of being prefect for the Dicastery of Divine Worship. And even if he limited Serre's actual influence, it did basically mean that there were no attacks on the Tridentine Mass. So I think that's really more what we should look out for, new personnel decisions. They'll become essential.
And let's talk about those personnel decisions, because I agree with you there. I think that's going to be extremely important. The thing I'm really looking at is the cardinals that are aligned with him. I am somewhat worried. This is one aspect that I'm more pessimistic about, is that his reserved temperament and also the sort of mandate that he has coming into this, which is to be that bridge building figure. I'm worried he might feel the need to appoint liberals that should not be cardinals, to give those people the red hat, or to give certain cardinals positions that they don't need, but he feels almost obligated to give. But who should we look to reasonably as a more conservative option for some of these, for some of the essential roles around him? Now, he's recently announced, I saw, that he's going to give a period of waiting before making changes to the Curia. But who do you see him bringing in? Who seems to be aligned with him policy-wise, and who are some reasonable hopes that we can have for that Curia? Do you have any people in mind?
Yes, I've actually been thinking of this for quite a bit of time, even before he became Pope, just the question of who a conservative cardinal, if he became Pope, should appoint. But first, to address that issue of giving the red hats to liberals, I think an advantage he might have coming into this is the fact that Pope Francis hasn't made any diocesan German or even Austrian bishop. He hasn't made any of them cardinal. It was one of the good things Francis did, that he really limited red hats for very liberal European states. And he also had this eccentric practice of passing over traditional cardinalate seats like Paris to appoint periphery cardinals instead. And that was somewhat of a mixed blessing for conservatives, because the current Archbishop of Paris is an open liberal who supports homosexuality. So that he got passed over for the red hat, ironically, worked in the favor of conservatives. So I think it's easier, at least for Pope Leo XIV, to not appoint new cardinals in Germany or Austria, at least initially in his first and maybe even his second consistory, to wait with that until the conflict with Germany has died down. I think what we should almost worry for more is that once Germany kind of pretends to do a mea culpa, pretends to stand down, he then might reward that with a red hat. But if he were to appoint one token liberal from Germany, that wouldn't even really be the problem. What is more important question is, will he go back to giving red hats to traditional cardinal sees that currently are filled with liberals? I think that's a more important question. Although I should note that even there, the damage might be limited, because the most liberal archbishops in Europe, not just in Paris, but also in Milan and all that, they're generally currently already over 70, because the more liberal bishops tend to be of the boomer generation. So because of that, even if they were to be made cardinal, they might very well already no longer be eligible to vote by the time that our new pope becomes 80. So the factor of age really helps there. It's indeed more the curial appointments that are important. And I think that's an advantage he has there, is that the current curie has a lot of moderate liberals, it has a lot of Parolin types, but it has very few German types. The only two cardinals that can really be viewed as being supportive of the German agenda, ironically, are Fernandez and Medonja from the dicastery of culture and education. Those two seem to lean in that direction. But ironically, while the important cardinals involved in the synod are both radical liberals, Hollerich and Greg, and there's very few curial prefects that are like that. Most of them share Parolin's hostility towards the German side of the path, or even more conservative than Parolin. So if he doesn't really want to rock the boat, and if he wants to seek consensus, he'll likely appoint new prefects who are more in line with Parolin, or even with, say, Yu Heng Sik of the Dicastery of the Clergy, Cardinal Koch of the Dicastery of Christian Unity, or Gugerotti of the Dicastery for Oriental Churches. If he appoints prefects who are like them, or heck, even like Roche, but as long as they're not like Fernandez or Medonja, who are outliers within the Curie. And I think Fernandez will currently be very isolated, because he took advantage of Francis's personal support to act really of his own initiative and to sideline people like Parolin and Roche. So I don't think they're going to forget that now. I think Fernandez has now lost his supporter, and I think he's very isolated. So if our new pope is just smart enough to ignore Fernandez and also Tolentino Bejonka, if he just follows the advice more of the moderate conservatives or even the centrists that Francis appointed, I think the Curie should be relatively fine. And I think, ironically, the prefects Francis left in the Curie aren't his worst legacy. So, yeah, that's the question. Will he go for a consensus with people like Parolin? Will he go for something more conservative? If so, we shouldn't worry too much.
Yeah, because I think again, it's somewhat of a disappointment, the fact that, like, one of the better case scenarios is that we get more people like Parolin. But even as you said, just to put things into perspective, because I do think an important factor here when looking at this is to make sure that things are in perspective of being relative to the current situation. And that is that the fact of the matter is, whether or not we like them or not, Parolin is slightly more, or even significantly more, conservative than some of the extremely radical progressive types. I think both are out of line. You can even say both are unorthodox in some senses. In some places, but the fact is that putting a Parolin there, somebody more aligned to Parolin, could put the Pope's curia and put the Pope in a position that he would still find himself opposed to the liberals and gradually over time become more and more conservative. That's why I'm not terribly pessimistic about that. Just maybe to conclude, Serre, I think looking forward to this pontificate, a final factor that I think we need to address is the political conflict that has been brought up in the mainstream media frequently, because he's an American pope. The Italian media loves talking about that. But of course, the American media is very focused on his past tweets concerning Donald Trump, concerning J.D. Vance. Do you think that this pope will be actively involved in American politics as we consider it? Of course, religion is always going to intersect with politics. It's the nature of morality. Both of them are dealing with such things. But do you see him as weighing in on the Trump administration? Because as you know, the Trump administration still has 3 years left. So do you see him weighing in during these 3 final years?
Possibly, but I think his temperament would have him first consult with the majority of American bishops. I think that's the way he would approach it. So if they were to say, don't say anything, or say something very moderate, or extend an olive branch, I think he's a lot more inclined to do it. Because if you look at his tweet history, while he reposted some criticisms of Francis and he referenced those in his time as prefect, I think they reflect more Pope Francis's influence, because in his past history, during the entire build-up to the 2016 election, he literally only tweeted something about Trump once. And ironically, it was a critical tweet about Trump from Cardinal Dolan, of all people, and Dolan had posted it in the summer of 2015. He retweeted that. He tweeted nothing else to criticize Trump, nothing. Ironically, after Hillary lost, he retweeted something by Eva Tien, which said that she had ignored pro-life voters at her own peril. That's what he retweeted. And in the years after that, 2017, 2018, he didn't really show any strong hostility towards Trump. He showed criticism of certain strong migration policies, but generally just by retweeting what certain bishops had said about it. And ironically, again, often he retweeted criticisms by conservative bishops like Chupich, let alone McElroy. He retweeted people like Archbishop Gomez from Los Angeles, who I think is very popular, ironically, amongst conservative Catholics in the United States. And I think even a lot of conservatives were angry Pope Francis never made him cardinal. He retweeted stuff like that. And I think he didn't really express himself too strongly until he was prefect and until the Pope was in direct conflict with Trump. And the fact that he then took sides briefly in a few tweets, that may have been the reason why Chupich would then want to be the next Pope. It may have been what won over certain moderate liberals. And I can imagine that, and I'm not saying that that's dishonest, but I can imagine it was just prudent on his part to emphasize that part of his perspective a little bit more when the conclave was near him, to not make himself seem like he was some kind of ultra-right candidate so that the media couldn't frame him. I can imagine that. But since it's a few tweets in basically a near 10-year-long tweet history where Trump was on everyone's minds, I don't think he'll take the same kind of strong stance where he of his own initiative attacks Trump. I don't think that's in his personality at all. So I don't think so. Also, if I may briefly go back to your previous question, I just still wanted to mention that something very good Pope Francis did was he did also appoint a couple of very orthodox cardinals from the peripheries. And I actually can see a few very specific candidates there that if he wants to be slightly daring, he can make them new prefects. Go from Singapore, he was made a cardinal by Francis, and he has a lot of knowledge of the peripheries, but he's a lot more liturgically conservative. He supports communion on the tongue as the norm. Stuff like that. Yeah. And he's also supportive of the Tridentine Mass in his archdiocese. That could be a good replacement for Roche. And Ambongo Bensumu from the Heart of Africa, he would be a great replacement of Farrell as the head of that whole dicastery for family, laity, and those matters. And since Farrell is already older than 77, he could replace him very quickly. So then he could appoint conservatives. He could appoint people with a different liturgical stance who were promoted by Francis. And so as such, he could in a way integrate the most conservative aspects of Francis' papacy in his papacy. And if he does that, that will also be relevant for things like this, like foreign policy issues, because a more conservative curie, but also a more truly periphery representative curie, which Francis's curie wasn't. It's at the end didn't really have any African prefix anymore. A curie that isn't like that, that is more truly representative, that has voices from Africa, I also think is less likely to obsessively focus on the United States. And I think that in that case, if he were to criticize Trump, it would be more likely to be over things that were to be very upsetting, not towards the left in the United States or towards Western politics, but things which African countries or Asian countries are upset about. He would be more of a global voice rather than a Western-centered voice, which Francis too often appeared to be to a lot of cardinals. So I think the issues there tie together a lot. Personnel policy and how well represented the peripheries truly are.
Yeah, and I think that makes total sense. And I think what I hope people are seeing is that there are paths forward where this new pope can certainly take us away from the chaos that we saw in the last pontificate. And so, as a concluding word, I think even though there are some areas that I'm certainly worried about. The issue with synodality and collegiality, I think it gets in some ways a bit too close for comfort. to the point where I think people can misunderstand certain things, or saying, there's so many issues concerning collegiality, where that could be a potential problem, and we could see people go into error. But at the same time, there are practical steps and there's practical paths where this Pope can adopt more conservative stances as a true belief. I think he does have a clear belief that he's demonstrated in the risen Christ and in the Blessed Mother. And those things can lead somebody, I know, to deepen one's devotion, to deepen one's own conservatism, attachment to tradition. And if he does that and he faces opposition from the liberals, I think over time we could see a more and more traditionalist, more and more conservative papacy. Of course, anything can happen. The world is very strange, and we could be incredibly disappointed. But I don't think anybody should be feeling hopeless during this time. I think there are clear paths for hope. There are clear reasons to hope. There are clear reasons to pray at the current moment for the Pope. But I don't think there's any reason to despair in this time. But Serre, do you have any final words about this papacy?
Yeah, I fully agree with what you're saying here. I can add that the transformation that you were predicting of how he could become more, well, not predicting, but you see as a possibility where he could become more conservative and traditionalist. It reminds me a lot of Ratzinger. Let's not forget that he was an ultra-progressive in the 50s and 60s, who became a moderate progressive after 68, then throughout the 70s a true moderate. But his true conservative conversion didn't really come till the days of John Paul II and further increased when he was Pope. I think that can very well happen with our current Pope, but it's even possible he's already a lot more traditionalist than a lot of people think, because some things worth keeping in mind is that he specifically did studies in canon law. He taught canon law at a seminary in the archdiocese where he served in Peru, and that actually is very similar to Cardinal Erdo. Now, a canon lawyer, someone with canon law experience, will already look at things very differently from Francis. That's just one factor. He's about 20 years younger than Francis, so his whole generational perspective, specifically in Vatican II, will be different. He is an Augustinian. He's not a Jesuit. He seems to be a lot more well-read than the Church Fathers and a lot more academic, which again makes him more similar to Benedict XVI. These are all factors that incline him to be more conservative. Augustinians specifically were used in Peru to counteract liberation theology, I should add. So that is another factor that can make him more conservative. He's shown gestures like visiting the Valley of the Fallen in Spain, which is actually quite controversial, but that has now recently come out. He seems to have been friendly with Opus Dei in Peru. So there's a lot of factors there that I think prevent him from being hostile towards traditionalists, from even being friendly with them. And that's not in any way counting on those rumors that he himself kept celebrating the Tridentine Mass after Traditionis Custodes. Putting those aside, there's a lot of things that would already make him more inclined to be conservative. And if you look at his expressions on contraception, on homosexuality, on gender ideology, that's all very hope-giving. And I've even heard from a reliable source who read his dissertation, and who even has it, seminarian, who says that the dissertation from our new Pope is actually a very conservative work that quotes Pope Pius XII a lot as a source, actually. So if that's the kind of man really secretly is, he might already be a lot more conservative. He might not be a moderate conservative who has to become a conservative. He might just have been a conservative or even a traditionalist sympathizer who was just very good at staying out of the limelight, which is compatible with his temperament. And obviously, I shouldn't leave out the fact that his eldest brother is now, it turns out, a Trump supporter. So I think that will probably lead him to not seek the most confrontational approach. It doesn't seem as though he has any links to radical people the way that Bergoglio had when he was elected in 2013. He doesn't have that. He doesn't have connections to people like Godfried de Nils or Fernandez or liberation theologians. The people you surround yourself with and your mentors, they will influence you. And I think that's a very final, important, hopeful note to end on, which is that a lot of people talk about his alleged friendship with Chubich. He was actually very close to Cardinal Francis George less than 10 years ago, to the point that Cardinal George visited him in a wheelchair when he was already pretty close to his death. He visited then Robert Francis Prevost in a wheelchair because it was his birthday. They were that close. Now, I think we all know that Cardinal George was an important supporter of Cardinal Pell, and he was one of the more conservative voices in the United States. So if that is an important influence on our new Pope, I think that already gives us reason to be optimistic.
Yeah, and I don't think it necessarily needs to be making him out to be a traditionalist, or I imagine the traditional movement, barring a complete turn to tradition, is always going to have some issues here and there with certain masses, with how he's saying mass, with certain things that are quoted, certain things he says. But there are certain goods that can come out of a papacy that we're talking about here. Just as we saw in Ratzinger's papacy, Benedict XVI, even though people might have issues with this or that, he did produce Summorum Pontificum, which allowed the growth of the traditional Latin Mass, and really is one of the foundations of the modern traditional movement being so strong as it is today. So all things to keep in mind. Serre, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a great show. And for all of our listeners, make sure you hit a like on this video. If you're listening to us, you can leave a 5-star review. That helps us out a lot. And may God grant you many joyful years. God bless.